She thought he was weak, until he kept rising after every hit. The arena was silent. Thousands of alien eyes stared down from the towering stands, waiting for the fight to end. They had seen this before, a human soldier standing against an alien warrior. It always ended the same way, fast and brutal. Commander Xyra stood tall in the center, her dark blue armor gleaming under the artificial lights. Her golden eyes studied the human before her. He was battered, bruised, and bleeding. His breath was heavy. His stance was weak. His name was Sergeant Elias Kane. Xyra had fought many battles in her life. She had crushed warriors twice her size. She had never lost in single combat. Yet there was something different about this human. He should have stayed down minutes ago. But every time she knocked him down, he got back up. She had broken his ribs. She had dislocated his shoulder. His face was swollen from her strikes. And yet, he stood there, fists clenched, refusing to surrender. Xyra narrowed her eyes. "Stay down, human," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You've proven your point. There is no shame in knowing your limits." Kane wiped the blood from his mouth. He smiled. It was a small, painful smile, but it was there. "Limits," he said, his voice rough. "I haven't found mine yet." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The alien spectators, members of the Galactic Coalition, had expected an easy win. Humans were new to the stars, still trying to prove they belonged in the great empire of civilizations. Many believed they were weak, unworthy of standing among the strongest species in the universe. This fight was supposed to be proof of that. Xyra had been chosen to end it quickly, to show that humans had no place among warriors. But now, the test was taking too long. She frowned. "You are injured," she said. "You cannot defeat me." Kane took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew she was right. Xyra was faster, stronger. She had centuries of combat training. He was just a soldier, one man, alone, on an alien world, facing a warrior who could end him with one clean strike. And yet, he refused to fall. Xyra moved fast, too fast for any normal human to react. Her foot lashed out, striking Kane's ribs again. The impact sent him crashing to the ground. A sharp pain tore through his body. His vision blurred. The crowd cheered. This was the end. Xyra turned away, sure he was finished. But then, Kane pushed himself up. His arms shook. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he still got to his feet. Xyra stopped. She turned, her golden eyes locking onto his. Silence filled the arena. She studied him, truly studied him for the first time. Why was he still standing? Any other species would have surrendered. Any sane fighter would have admitted defeat. But this human, this fragile, broken creature, was still fighting. A memory flashed in Kane's mind. He was a boy, sitting on his grandfather's porch, listening to old war stories. "Do you know why humans win, Elias?" his grandfather had said. "Not because we are strong, not because we are smart, but because we refuse to stay down. That is our gift. That is our curse." Kane exhaled slowly. He lifted his fists again. Xyra's hands clenched at her sides. "Why?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Why do you fight when you cannot win?" Kane chuckled, though it hurt to do so. "Winning?" He shook his head. "You think I fight to win?" Xyra frowned. She didn't understand. Kane met her gaze, his eyes burning with something she had never seen before. Defiance. "I fight because I'm still breathing," he said. "And if I can still stand, I can still fight." A chill ran through Xyra's spine. This was not what she had expected. Kane took a shaky step forward. His body screamed at him to stop, but he ignored it. The crowd murmured again. This was no longer a simple fight. Xyra exhaled. She raised her fists. "Very well, human," she said, her voice quieter now. "Let's see how long you can stand." She moved again, striking with blinding speed. Kane dodged. Not entirely, but enough to avoid a killing blow. He moved on instinct, reacting faster than before. His body should have been failing, but he was adapting. Learning. Zaira noticed it, too. Another hit. Cain stumbled but stayed up. Another. He faltered, but his fists remained raised. The crowd was no longer cheering for Zaira. They were watching Cain in disbelief. He should not be alive. He should not be moving. And yet, with each hit, each fall, each breath, he kept rising. She thought he was weak, until he kept rising after every hit. Zaira clenched her fists, her sharp nails pressing against her palms. This human should have fallen by now. He should have accepted defeat. Yet he stood before her, bruised and broken but unyielding. It was unnatural. It was impossible. She had fought warriors from 100 worlds, each stronger than the last. Some were like living stone, their bodies nearly indestructible. Others moved faster than light, their reflexes honed over centuries. All of them had limits. She knew how far they could go before they broke. But this human, this fragile creature, whose body was built for nothing more than endurance, whose species had only recently left their homeworld, stood against her with nothing but sheer willpower. It made no sense. Cain inhaled sharply, tasting blood in his mouth. His body screamed at him to stop, but he silenced it. Pain was an old companion, a whisper in his ear, reminding him that he was alive. He had felt it before, on Earth, in the cold and the dust, where men were pushed past their breaking points and forced to find something deeper inside themselves. Pain is temporary, his drill sergeant had once told him. Fear is just your body lying to you. Listen to neither. Cain exhaled. His arms felt heavy, his vision blurred at the edges, but he refused to fall. Zaira circled him now, slower this time, studying him like a predator unsure of its prey. The crowd was no longer cheering for her. They watched in silence, fascinated, uncertain. Even the high-ranking officials in the stands leaned forward, whispering to one another. Cain smirked, wiping blood from his mouth. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice hoarse but steady. "Running out of ways to break me." Zaira's golden eyes narrowed. She had never encountered an opponent like this before. If strength wouldn't break him, what would? She rushed forward, her movements precise and practiced. Her fist drove into Cain's stomach, lifting him off the ground. He barely had time to register the hit before she twisted, slamming him into the cold metal floor. The impact rattled his bones. The arena echoed with the sound of his body hitting the ground. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, he didn't move. Zaira took a slow breath. It was over. But then, his fingers twitched. The crowd gasped as Cain pressed his palms against the floor, gritting his teeth as he pushed himself up once more. His arms trembled, his ribs screamed in protest, but he did not stop. Zaira took a step back. Cain rose to his feet. His stance was unsteady, his breath ragged, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Zaira's heart pound. Defiance. He smiled through the pain, the edges of his lips curling like a man who had nothing to lose. "Not bad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You almost had me." Zaira felt something she had never felt before. Doubt. She should not be afraid of this human. He was weaker than her in every way. His bones were brittle, his skin was soft, his body was failing. Yet, standing before him, she could not shake the feeling that she was the one being tested. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "You are reckless," she said, her voice softer now. "You fight when you cannot win. That is foolish." Cain chuckled, though it hurt to do so. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "Winning isn't about being the strongest. It's about refusing to lose." Zaira stared at him. In all her years of war, no enemy had ever spoken to her like this. No warrior had ever looked at her, not with fear, not with admiration, but with understanding. This wasn't just a battle to him. It was something more. She stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Tell me, human," she said, "why do you keep standing?" Cain met her gaze. "Because I can." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the high-ranking officials in the stands remained silent. Zyra studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well." She raised her fists once more. "Then let's see how long you can." Zyra had faced warriors who could shatter mountains with a single strike. She had stood against creatures whose skin was harder than steel, and whose reflexes were honed over centuries of combat. But none of them, none, had unnerved her the way this human did. He was weaker, slower, and on the verge of collapse, yet he stood there, staring at her with that maddening fire in his eyes. The crowd had changed. What had started as a spectacle, a mere formality, had become something more. The alien spectators no longer jeered at the human. They watched in uneasy silence, as if they too were beginning to understand something they were never meant to. Cain rolled his shoulders, wincing as pain flared through his ribs. He was running on fumes now, every breath a battle, every movement an act of defiance. He knew that logically he should have stopped. Every survival instinct in his body screamed at him to surrender. But logic had never defined humanity's greatest moments. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He had been in worse situations before. Maybe not against a 7-foot alien warrior who could kill him in a single well-placed strike, but he had fought through exhaustion, through pain, through fear. He had bled before. He had suffered before. And every time, he had survived. Zyra exhaled sharply. "You are pushing past your limits, human," she said. "There is nothing left in you. You are running on will alone." Cain smirked, his lips split and bleeding. "That's the trick, isn't it?" he said. "You think limits are real. We don't." A flicker of something crossed Zyra's expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something more dangerous. Understanding. She had heard of human endurance before. The stories had spread through the coalition, their soldiers surviving impossible conditions, their pilots refusing to eject even when death was certain, their explorers pushing forward into the void with nothing but stubbornness keeping them alive. But stories were just words. Seeing it in front of her was something else entirely. For the first time, she hesitated. And Cain saw it. He adjusted his stance. His muscles screamed, his vision blurred, but he ignored it. He had to keep pushing. That was the only way. Zyra moved, faster than before, a blur of motion. Cain braced himself, knowing he wouldn't be able to dodge this one. Her fist shot toward him, aimed at his ribs. But at the last second, he shifted. The punch still connected, but not fully. Instead of breaking him, it sent him stumbling. She had pulled back. Zyra had held back. A realization rippled through the arena. The warrior who had never hesitated, never wavered, had doubted herself for the first time. Cain coughed, tasting copper, but he grinned. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" he said. "You're wondering what it means." Zyra didn't respond, because she was wondering. The coalition had always believed that power meant dominance, that strength was measured by force. But this human had rewritten the rules without ever landing a winning blow. He should have been broken. Instead, he was forcing her to change. Cain took a step forward. His legs shook, but he stood tall. "Pain doesn't stop us," he said. "Fear doesn't stop us. Defeat doesn't stop us." He met her gaze, unwavering. "So tell me, Commander, how do you stop something that refuses to break?" Zyra had no answer. The crowd had no answer. The coalition leaders, watching from the highest seats, whispered among themselves. This was no longer just a fight. It was a message. Zyra exhaled and raised her fists once more. "Then let's see how far you can go," she said. And the battle continued. Zyra moved first. Her strikes were measured, precise. No wasted motion, no unnecessary force. She had fought enough battles to know when an opponent was nearing their breaking point. The human had lasted longer than expected, but he was reaching the edge. And yet, something inside her hesitated. Cain was battered, barely standing, his breathing ragged. His body was failing, but his will was not. That was the part she couldn't understand. No warrior she had ever faced had fought like this. Not the strongest, not the most disciplined, not even those who believed in honor and duty. The human fought with something else. Not skill, not strategy, something deeper. Zaira feinted left, drawing Cain's attention, then spun and aimed a powerful strike at his right side. He should have fallen. His reactions should have been too slow. But they weren't. Cain twisted, just slightly, just enough, and took the hit at an angle. It still hurt, still sent fire through his ribs, but he turned the force against itself, reducing the damage. Zaira's golden eyes narrowed. He was learning. Pain had become his teacher. She stepped back, just slightly, re-evaluating the fight. That was when she noticed something unsettling. The crowd, the aliens who had once dismissed him, were no longer cheering for her. They were watching him. Not in pity, not in amusement, in awe. Cain wiped blood from his chin and smiled at her, that maddening human grin. "Getting slower, Commander," he rasped. Zaira tilted her head. "You're adapting." Cain shrugged. "We always do." The truth of that statement echoed louder than any punch she could throw. Humans, this strange, chaotic species, had no business surviving in the wider galaxy. They were physically weaker than most. They were outmatched in nearly every way. And yet, they survived. More than that, they refused not to. Zaira clenched her fists. She was a warrior. She had trained her entire life for battle. Strength, discipline, strategy. These were what determined victory. But Cain was proving something terrifying. Those things weren't enough. Not against humanity. She lunged again, faster this time, her fist aimed directly at his face. Cain couldn't dodge this one. Not completely. He didn't try. Instead, he leaned into the motion, rolling with the hit instead of resisting it. He staggered but didn't fall. He caught himself, breath hitching, body screaming in protest. But then he did what he always did. He stood back up. A ripple went through the crowd. Even the high-ranking officials in the observation deck leaned forward. Zaira saw it now. This wasn't just about Cain anymore. It was about what he represented. The aliens watching had spent centuries believing in a hierarchy of strength. The strong ruled, the weak submitted. But this human, this fragile creature, had shattered that belief. Cain had been losing from the beginning. And yet, he was the one winning. Because he refused to break. Zaira exhaled. "You shouldn't be standing." Cain chuckled. "You keep saying that. Hasn't been true yet." She studied him for a long moment. Her body was fine. Her energy still high. She could end this. She could finish it now. And yet she wasn't sure if she wanted to. Because deep down, a quiet realization had settled in. This fight wasn't about whether humans were strong. It was about whether they could be stopped. And the answer was becoming terrifyingly clear. They couldn't. Zaira raised her fists once more. She had been sent here to prove humanity was weak. But now she wasn't sure if she even could. Zaira took a slow breath. Her fists were still raised, her stance unshaken, but something inside her had changed. She had walked into this fight knowing the outcome before it began. She had believed this human, like all the others, would break. But now, with the weight of 1,000 alien eyes watching, she realized she had made a mistake. Cain should not be standing. His legs should have given out. His body should have collapsed under the force of the punishment it had endured. She had struck him with every ounce of strength a seasoned warrior could muster. She had shattered his ribs, split his skin, and driven him to the brink of unconsciousness. And yet, somehow, impossibly, he refused to fall. Zaira could feel it now, that thing that set him apart, not just from other warriors, but from every species she had ever fought. It wasn't power. It wasn't skill. It was will. Cain rolled his shoulders, shaking off the pain as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience. Blood trickled down his chin. His breath came in uneven bursts. But his eyes, those damn human eyes, still burned with defiance. The crowd around them had shifted, no longer the amused spectators who had come to watch a human fail. The jeers had faded. The laughter had died. Now they only watched in silence, waiting, uncertain, questioning. Zira had never felt their gaze like this before. It was not expectation they projected. It was something far more dangerous. Doubt. For the first time, the unshakable belief in the superiority of the coalition's greatest warriors was uncertain. For the first time, they were witnessing something that did not make sense. Zira clenched her jaw. She had been chosen for this fight because she was the best, because she had never been defeated, because she knew how to break an opponent. And yet, standing before this bloodied human, she felt something she had never felt before. Hesitation. Not fear. Not yet. But something close. She lunged forward again, unwilling to let the doubt take root. Her movements were sharper this time. Faster. She struck high, low, feinted left, twisted, adjusted mid-motion. Each move designed to keep Cain off balance, to exploit the weakness that had to be there. And he should have fallen. He should have collapsed. But he didn't. Cain didn't move like a warrior trained from birth. He wasn't faster than her, wasn't stronger, wasn't even close to her skill. But he learned. Every time she hit him, he took something from it. A fraction of a second faster. A slight shift in his stance. An adjustment so small most would miss it. But Cyrus saw it. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was adapting. She threw a brutal hook aimed at his temple, enough force to knock him unconscious. But at the last moment, Cain moved just enough. The blow still connected, but not fully. He staggered but did not fall. Zyra's heartbeat quickened. He was reading her. She stepped back, chest rising and falling, golden eyes locked on his face. He was smiling again, the small, painful, knowing smile. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" he rasped, voice raw but steady. Zyra narrowed her eyes. Cain took a slow, careful step forward. "You were supposed to show them that humans are weak," he continued. "That we don't belong here. That we can't stand against warriors like you." His grin widened, just a little. But now, they're wondering something else. Silence. Thousands of eyes locked on them. Zyra knew what he meant. She could feel it in the air, in the way the tension had shifted, in the way even the highest-ranking officials in the stands had stopped speaking. This fight had stopped being about Cain. It had stopped being about her. This was something else now. Something bigger. This was a test of humanity itself. And the answer was terrifying. Zyra exhaled, lowering her stance, reevaluating the fight. If she had been taking him lightly before, that was over now. She would end this. She surged forward, moving faster than before. This time, she wasn't testing him. She wasn't holding back. She struck with full force, every motion designed to finish this once and for all. Cain barely dodged the first strike. The second caught his side. The third slammed into his shoulder. He staggered, barely stayed upright. Then she hit him with the force of a meteor. Her fist slammed into his chest, and this time, Cain could not stop himself from falling. His back hit the cold metal floor of the arena. The silence in the stadium was deafening. Zyra took a slow breath. It was over. Finally. She turned away. Then a sound. A cough. A slow, dragging inhale. Zyra stopped mid-step. And behind her, Cain moved. A ripple went through the crowd. He pressed his palms against the ground. His muscles trembled. His body screamed in agony. But inch by inch, he rose. Zyra turned fully, watching as Cain staggered to his feet once more. He swayed but did not fall. His breath was heavy, his body barely functioning, but still, he stood. Zyra's stomach twisted. She had fought warriors from across the galaxy, had seen countless battles, had crushed opponents who thought they were strong. But she had never seen this before. She had never seen something so utterly unstoppable. For the first time in her life, Zyra felt it, something cold curling in her chest, something foreign, something alien to her warrior soul. Fear, not of Cain, not of this one human, but of what he represented. If one human could do this, what would happen when humanity rose together? Cain wiped blood from his chin and grinned. "Still here," he said. Zyra didn't respond, because, for the first time, she had no idea what to say. Zyra could hear her own breathing now. Slow, steady, controlled. But her heart was pounding. Not from exhaustion, not from effort, but from something far worse. Uncertainty. She had fought in hundreds of battles. She had faced the fiercest warriors across the galaxy. She had broken enemies who were faster, stronger, and more ruthless than this human. And yet, standing before her, bloody but unbroken, was a man who defied everything she had ever known. Elias Cain should have lost this fight a long time ago. And yet here he was, still standing, still defying. Zyra saw the shift in the arena. The once rowdy crowd had been reduced to silence. The officials in the high seats were whispering among themselves. Even the other warriors, the ones who had mocked the human at the start, were watching now, not in amusement, not in condescension, but in awe. The coalition had always operated under one belief, that power determined worth. The strong ruled, the weak submitted, the weak broke. But Cain had not broken. He had endured everything thrown at him and still refused to fall. And if one human could do this, what did that mean for their entire species? Cain wiped the blood from his mouth, breathing heavily. His body was screaming at him to stop, but he ignored it. Pain wasn't new. It wasn't an enemy. It was just another thing to push through. He had done it before. He would do it again. And if the aliens watching thought this fight had ever been about victory, they didn't understand humans at all. Cain wasn't here to win. He was here to prove a point. And right now, looking into Zyra's golden eyes, he knew he already had. He saw it in her hesitation. He saw it in the way her stance had changed. She was still stronger, still faster, still the better warrior in every way. But there was something else there now. Doubt. She had never faced an opponent like him before. Because there had never been an opponent like him before. Zyra inhaled deeply. If this fight had been about showcasing the superiority of the coalition, it had failed. Cain had turned this into something else. A question. One that neither she nor the watching coalition had an answer for. Her fingers flexed. She could still end this fight. She could take him down with a single decisive blow. But what then? Would it even mean anything? Would it change what had just happened? Even if he fell, the message had already been sent, because Cain had proven that humanity would not break. And if a species could not be broken, then they could never be conquered. The weight of that realization pressed down on Zyra's chest. She had been so certain, so confident, but now she was no longer sure who had won this fight. Because even as Cain staggered, battered and barely standing, the truth was undeniable. He was still here. And if this was just one human soldier, then humanity as a whole was a nightmare waiting to be unleashed. Cain exhaled, his smirk returning despite the pain. He wasn't sure what was going through Zyra's mind right now, but he could see it. The shift, the recognition, the fear of the unknown. They had thought humans were weak. Now, they weren't so sure. Cain straightened as best he could, ignoring the fire in his ribs. He took a step forward, not to fight, not to attack, but to simply exist in that moment. Zyra held his gaze, and then something happened that no one in the arena expected. She lowered her fists. A ripple went through the crowd. The warriors watching stiffened. The officials leaned forward, some of them standing, as if they couldn't believe what they had just seen. Zyra, The undefeated, the relentless, the pinnacle of coalition strength, had made a decision. She had chosen to stop. Not because she had been ordered to. Not because she was physically unable to continue. But because, in that moment, she knew the truth. This fight was no longer about proving humanity was weak. It was about accepting that they weren't. She let out a slow breath and looked at Cain with something different in her gaze now. Not superiority. Not condescension. Respect. "Enough," she said, her voice calm but firm. Cain blinked, surprised. "That's it?" he asked. "You giving up?" Zyra's lips curled slightly at the edges. "No," she said. "I am acknowledging." Cain tilted his head, watching her carefully. "You think this was a fight?" Zyra continued, stepping closer. "It was not. It was a test. For you, for your species," she exhaled. "And I believe I have my answer." Cain raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Zyra held his gaze. "You are not to be underestimated." A hush fell over the arena. That single statement carried more weight than any strike she had thrown. The coalition had wanted to prove humanity was weak. Instead, they had just witnessed something far more dangerous. Not power, not aggression. The refusal to break. Zyra turned, walking away without another word. The battle was over, but the impact of what had happened here would echo far beyond this arena. The coalition would rethink their stance on humanity, because they had seen it with their own eyes. And if this was what humans were like when they were outmatched, outnumbered, and on the brink of collapse, what would happen if they were ever given a real chance? Cain stood there, watching her go, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. He had walked into this fight to prove humanity wasn't weak. He hadn't realized, until now, that he had done something far greater. He had made them afraid. Cain stood there, his body screaming in protest, his lungs burning with every breath. His vision blurred at the edges, but he remained upright, watching as Commander Zyra turned her back on the fight. It was over. She had chosen to walk away. Not because she was beaten, not because she was tired, but because she had realized something that no one in this arena had considered before the fight began. This was never about Cain. It was about what he represented. The coalition had expected to witness humanity's limits. They had wanted a demonstration of the human breaking point, a moment where Cain would collapse, admit defeat, and show the galaxy that Earth's people were just another species, weak, unworthy, forgettable. But that moment never came. Instead, Cain had stood against one of the greatest warriors the coalition had to offer and refused to fall. He had endured every blow, pushed past every injury, and in doing so, he had done something no one thought possible. He had made them doubt. The air in the arena was thick with it. The silence, once filled with the arrogance of certainty, now felt uneasy, uncertain. Cain looked up toward the highest seats, where the most powerful figures of the coalition sat. They had expected a lesson in human weakness. Instead, they had seen a warning. If one human could do this, what happened when they all stood together? One of the officials, an elder with gray skin and deep-set eyes, leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "He should be dead," he murmured. "No species can withstand that." Another beside him, a reptilian warlord, hissed softly. "It is not strength," he said. "It is something worse." A third, a diplomat from a world that had never seen war, swallowed hard. "Resilience," she whispered. "They do not stop." Zyra had rejoined her fellow warriors, but she did not sit. She stood, arms crossed, golden eyes locked onto Cain. She knew what they were all thinking. The question was no longer about whether humanity could survive among the stars. The question was, what happens when they refuse not to? Cain swayed slightly, his muscles betraying him after the prolonged battle. He wanted to collapse, to let the exhaustion finally take him, but something inside him refused. Not yet. He had one more thing to do. He took a slow step forward, then another. He could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, could sense the ripple of unease that spread through the arena. Every instinct, every tradition of the coalition, said that he should have taken the defeat, that he should have yielded when the fight was over. But humans didn't do that. They didn't just fight. They didn't just survive. They endured. And now, they had proven it to the entire coalition. Cain raised his head and met Syra's gaze. He could see something in her expression, something new. Not pity, not frustration. Respect. She gave him a slow nod, a warrior's acknowledgement, and that meant more than any words could have. Then, without breaking eye contact, Cain smiled. Not just at her, at all of them. At the officials watching from above, at the warriors who had doubted him, at the entire coalition that had underestimated his kind, because they understood now. This was not the end of a fight. It was the beginning of a war they would never be able to win. Not because humans were stronger, not because they had better weapons, but because they could not be broken. And that made them unstoppable. The arena lights flickered, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken realizations. The coalition's leaders exchanged glances, but none of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The test had been meant to humble humanity. Instead, it had changed the future forever. One by one, the spectators began to leave. Some were silent, others deep in thought, but all of them would return to their worlds with a single undeniable truth. Humanity had arrived. And they were not afraid. Cain exhaled slowly, allowing himself to finally drop to one knee. His body had nothing left to give, but he had already won. Because they knew now. The universe would never look at Earth the same way again. And one day, sooner than they expected, humanity would rise together.